I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Thank you very much. All right, good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody's doing well. I appreciate you all coming. Before I get started, I just want to say thanks to the organizers of this event, Blacks in Government, Luis and Michelle, for putting this together. It's an honor to be here, especially not only to get to talk about a little bit about Malcolm X and Dr. King, but to do it on what is my wife's birthday. So happy birthday as well to her. Just going to read a quick statement, and then we'll go through this presentation. As quickly as I can. It's likely to be, unfortunately, a little bit rushed. I want to be mindful of the time, but hopefully we'll have time for some Q&A and follow-up conversation a little bit later. My point today is simply that Malcolm X and Dr. King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., were far more similar politically than is often acknowledged. That both were dedicated to a radicalism that caused them to be equally treated with descending levels of hostility by mainstream civil rights leadership and the state itself, and that this can be demonstrated by an examination of mainstream media coverage of both men. Both Malcolm X and Dr. King have similarly been assigned shifting media roles as villain, as hero, then King with a fall from grace, and both with a kind of fictive resurrection, not unlike the most famous of its kind, a rebirth into fantasies of the political elite. Of course, both men were similarly dispatched in eerily similar circumstances, and worse still, both have seen their wonderfully brilliant and radical ideas omitted, diminished, and distorted beyond recognition. Their movements have largely only benefited the very segments of this society they were both most critical of, and the changes they sought rarely exist beyond symbol. Kwame Ture could never have been more correct than now when he once said that black visibility is not black power. So today in Forbes, we read, for instance, that almost half of the world's wealth is now owned by just 1% of the population. The wealth of the 1% richest people in the world amounts to $110 trillion, which is 65 times the total wealth of the bottom half of the world's population. The bottom half of the world's population owns the same as the richest 85% of 85 people in the world. So 85 people have more wealth in this world than half of the world's population. 7 out of 10 people live in countries where economic inequality has increased over the last 30 years. The richest 1% increased their share of income in 24 out of 26 countries, for which we have data between 1980 and 2012. In the United States, the wealthiest 1% captured 95% of post-financial crisis growth since 2009, with the bottom 90%, where the bottom 90% actually became poorer. So we know also that there are more black people in prison today in this country than were held at the height of enslavement on plantations. We know that political prisoners, too, continue to languish in prisons for truly looking to uphold the struggle as Malcolm and King had left it. So as long as we have Leonard Peltier and Mumia Abu-Jamal and Sundiata Acoli and Marshall Eddie Conway locked up not far up the road from here, I think that's also evidence of a lack of change, certainly the kind of change that King and Malcolm were fighting for. We know also that the Economic Policy Institute has said that black people exist in what they call a permanent recession, and that the United for a Fair Economy group has said that as we approach the soon coming moment of a white minority in this country, that what we will have in actual effect, or fact rather, is an apartheid state, where that minority overwhelmingly controls the wealth and resources of this country. So we know that both Malcolm and King criticized in their own time. We know that what Malcolm and King criticized in their own time as the absence of real progress or change, an absence of real redistribution downward and outward of all the resources and wealth in this country, of genuine political and psychological shifts among white people, in particular white liberals and the black bourgeoisie. All this is only intensified beneath a veneer of change under which Malcolm X described as this country's perfection, as he said, of the science of image making. So in other words, greetings and welcome to the end of my preamble. And so what we'll do is, as I said, we'll go through a quick presentation I've been putting together over the years, using which is really meant to talk about using popular media representation of both men to talk about what their actual politics were and what happened to those ideas subsequent to their physical assassinations as we move forward. So that video produced a few years ago by a good friend of mine, Billy Bunton, I think very nicely encapsulates some of what is what I want to talk about here today, at least briefly, about where Dr. King and Malcolm X were, why they were seen as such a threat, why their ideas are still relevant today, and why they were as such treated by popular media then and now. Very quickly, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I'm mindful of the time, but Soot Jali is a strong media scholar, very important media scholar, and I just included a couple of quotations from him here as we talk a little bit about mass media, to talk a little bit about the role and the function that they play politically. So as he says here, it is best to not discuss communication media in an isolated manner, but as being integrated within wider socioeconomic frameworks. In this regard, it is especially instructive to examine the relation between the mode of communication and the mode of production, to see the development of communication media as responding to changes in the broader set of social relations. So simply put, media play a political function in shaping the images and the consciousness in a given society to mirror the will of the political elite. Similarly, as he said, media are not neutral technology, but are seen as practices responding to the dominant tendencies of societies, and especially powerful groups within societies, and in turn, by mediating and translating social relations, acting as forces within society itself. As Herbert Schiller remarks, technology is a social construct and serves the prevailing systems of social power, though it often contributes to changes in the organization and distribution of that power. This, I think, would be a very important comment if we were going to talk more about the sort of what I would argue is the fallacy of change associated with the internet and social media, but we'll have to table that at least for now. But I at least wanted to put these in there so that we could, as we talk about media, it a little bit contextualizes at least my own approach to the role media play, and in this case, into determining for us versions of these two great men and the movements that produced them. Very quickly, I just wanted to show a clip here because I think it's important. We really can't talk about Dr. King or Malcolm X or their depiction in media without talking about, the political context of the time then, and I would argue now. And it's important to note a little bit about the counterintelligence program. So I just want to play this little promo of a brilliant documentary produced a couple of years ago from the Freedom Archives in California called COINTELPRO 101. A brief introduction into the FBI's counterintelligence program. And then we'll talk in a moment its impact on this conversation more specifically.
Back in the 1950s.
This, of course, is also important given the recent book published, I think within the last month, about the people who broke into the media Pennsylvania offices, FBI offices, and uncovered the documents proving that there was a counterintelligence program. And the book, I think, recently published talks about their transfer of that information to the press. For us today, I think it's important also because we have to understand that from immediately after the March on Washington, and even really preceding that, Dr. King was targeted, in this case by William C. Sullivan, J. Edgar Hoover's head of covert operations in the United States, as someone that they needed to neutralize, as he said. He said that immediately after the March on Washington, we must mark Dr. King now, if we have not done so before, as the most dangerous Negro of the future of in this nation from the standpoint of communism, the Negro, and national security. So immediately, Dr. King was seen as a threat, and this is even preceding what would become his eventual more radical political evolution. The counterintelligence program stated in reference to the black struggle here in the United States that its goal was to prevent the rise of a black messiah who could unify and electrify the militant black nationalist movement. Malcolm X might have been such a messiah. He is the martyr of the movement today. This was written in 1966, a year after Malcolm's assassination. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and Elijah Muhammad all aspired to this position. King could be a very real contender for this position should he abandon his supposed obedience to white liberal doctrine, nonviolence, and embrace black nationalism. And it's important, again, just for the purposes of this conversation, to remember these names in particular, not only Dr. King's, but Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture and Elijah Muhammad, because that's going to come back into the conversation here in just a moment. But again, the federal government was already concerned at what was happening with the black struggle in this country and was concerned about where Dr. King was going to go. As sources of media, of mainstream media and political hostility, because it's also important, we'll talk a little bit more hopefully about the fact that Dr. King was ostracized by much of the mainstream civil rights leadership by the end of his life, and certainly by the mainstream press. His stances against the Vietnam War, his stances, his increasingly open criticism of capitalism as an economic model, his frustration, again, with white liberals and the black bourgeoisie for not holding their own in this struggle, all made him become somewhat of a pariah in the movement towards the end of his life. And this is not often discussed. It's not often discussed publicly. But so some of the reasons why he and Malcolm X were both seen as pariahs in different times and circumstances, and why they were both treated similarly by the mainstream press and the political establishment is just summarized here, is because both expressed deep commitments to black unity and to extending that unity to global anti-colonial and imperial struggles. They both expressed fealty to anti-capitalist ideas. Both expressed strong and particular criticism of the black bourgeoisie and white liberals. Both expressed zero confidence in legislation and conventional methods of protest politics. And both expressed support for direct action campaigns. So it's important to note, and this is where, well, I'll come back to that in just a moment. Let me go through this part real quick also. In some research conducted by Kimberly Powell and Sonia Amundsen, they looked at the mainstream coverage of Malcolm X and Dr. King from the years of 1963 to 1965, and summarized what they found is that the media created an image of Malcolm X as violent, power-hungry, as a violent, power-hungry extremist who was primarily interested in harming the white population in the United States. Contrasting Malcolm X with Martin Luther King Jr. in the media fostered this negative image. The two men were described as opposite ends of the spectrum. King is advocating nonviolence. X is advocating violence. King is a black minister. X as an ex-convict. King is a civil rights leader. X as a racial fanatic. So it's important to note that earlier on, before particularly Dr. King's more radical political evolution, he was used as a contrasting element to give legitimacy to what the state and the mainstream civil rights movement preferred as the movement's trajectory. Nonviolent, integrationist, locally based, nationally based, not extending the movement overseas. Similarly, they said black Muslims and thus Malcolm X were characterized as extremists within the media. The media created this image with the terms used to describe Malcolm X and black Muslims: anti-Christian, anti-white, alienation, agitators, black supremacy, bitter, confrontation, cult, enemy, extremist, exploit, hate, militant, separation, sect, threat, and trouble. These terms appeared frequently and with high intensity, shaping a negative image of Malcolm X in the media. Joshua Grimm, in his research on similarly on the coverage of Malcolm X and Dr. King in the mainstream press from 1960 to 65, showed that the New York Times constructed oppositional identities of the two black leaders, and Malcolm X was framed as a doppelganger to King. They were portrayed as opposite men with opposite goals. So what I've done over the years is sort of to extend from where those researchers stopped in 1965 and showed how the mainstream press characterized Dr. King going forward, and to see some of these important changes. And we'll just go through some of this very quickly. I use the Washington Post, which is often seen as the leader of the establishment press, as my guidepost here, although you heard from Brian Jones in the video that Newsweek and Time were similarly talking about Dr. King in disparaging terms, particularly after his Riverside Church speech in 1967, where he openly condemned the Vietnam War and the U.S. presence in that conflict. And from that moment on, Time and Newsweek and others started describing him as a fool, a buffoon, someone who had wasted his cachet with the movement and who was wasting his moment. And what you see here is, starting in 1965, you can see that Dr. King is on the top 10 list for candidates of Man of the Year for 1965. This is from January of 1966. So he's still seen as someone, wow, this is great. You know, Malcolm X had just been assassinated. There was a desire to sort of solidify the new popular leadership of the civil rights movement. Dr. King was still in good shape. But in January of 1966, he starts to talk about what they call opening new rights drives. Economic boycotts, rent strikes were planned for that summer in Chicago. And those two summers in 66 and 67 in Chicago were instrumental for Dr. King's radicalization. Where he said here, our primary objective will be to bring the unconditional surrender of forces dedicated to the creation and maintenance of slums and to ultimately make slums a financial and moral liability upon the whole community. They were going to actually go into communities, take the rent from poor people, and instead of giving it to the slumlords, use it to fix those communities. This was considered the most significant Northern freedom movement development ever attempted in the major civil rights groups. Then, going back to one of the names I mentioned earlier, being watched by the counterintelligence program. In February of 1966, at the 1-year anniversary of Malcolm's assassination, Dr. King goes to Chicago and sits down with Elijah Muhammad and starts to talk with him about ways that they might collaborate in this struggle moving forward. And again, talking about how they're going to take the rent money that should have gone to slumlords and use those funds to refurbish these communities. So again, but just to reiterate very quickly, King was meeting with people that the counterintelligence program had seen as a threat. This is sort of building towards the threat that they would eventually say that Dr. King had become. So initially, when he goes to Sweden to accept the Nobel Peace Prize, King is pressured on all sides of civil rights and political leadership not to internationalize the civil rights struggle. Don't go overseas and start talking about black people here. Go get your award, be happy, have fun. If you ever read the histories, he had a lot of fun. If you ever read the Bible, the Bible, he did have a lot of fun. But don't talk about civil rights. And initially he agrees. He says, okay, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. He's told to stick to his own knitting. This is again in April of 1966. Talking about Vietnam would seriously jeopardize, as he was told, the new civil rights legislation that the mainstream civil rights leadership wanted. So stay quiet. Don't mess anything up. But by May of 1966, growing concerns develop about where King is going politically. So one congressperson circulates a petition, and 106,341 people signed this petition to have Martin Luther King brought up on charges with the House Committee on Un-American Activities, HUAC, saying he's leading towards communism, he's leading towards socialism, he's friendly with these black power people. What is he doing? In February of 1968, moving ahead a little bit, headlines talking about King appeals to the Negro middle class, who he attacks as saying they're not doing they're not upholding their end of the bargain. He says a conscientious objector in the war. He has become a conscientious objector in the war against poverty, saying that they had become rather conscientious objectors in the war against poverty. You're not upholding your role. The whole struggle here was not to make a few middle-class Negroes successful. We're supposed to have a complete overthrow here. Finally, within 90 days of his assassination, on February 19, 1968, the Washington Post runs a headline, "Fear is growing among top officials in the White House and Justice Department that Martin Luther King's March of the Poor will be a stunning victory for Stokely Carmichael." They associate Dr. King's ideas in developing politics and movement goals with Lenin, V.I. Lenin, and the Communist Party, being friendly with black power rights like Stokely Carmichael. Fear is growing among top officials within the White House and the Justice Department that, again, King is having what the COINTEL program was saying initially needed to be monitored. King was actually becoming what they feared, somebody who was abandoning his obedience to white liberalism, to liberalism in general, and was accepting a more radical position, and therefore was inspiring fears among top officials in the U.S. government. As the recently deceased Amiri Baraka said, and I think quite rightly, it is an axiomatic understanding that should arm us if we understand that whether we supported Garvey or Du Bois, they both got essentially the same treatment by the bourgeois state. Ditto Dr. King or Malcolm X. Whichever these giants we favored, we should be clear the state murdered them both. So just a quick few comments. I don't think we have enough time really to get into this at this point. It's important to note that it has been, I think, meticulously researched and shown not only in the 1999, which should have been the trial of the year or the trial of the century in 1999, where the King family took Lloyd Jowers to court and tried him and the United States government in front of a jury of 12 people, 6 white, 6 black, who came back after hearing all the unearthed evidence and said the United States government was in fact involved in an assassination of Dr. King. So as we look at pictures of both assassinations, it's important to note that the federal government was involved in both. For each, first, just interestingly, to maybe draw some of those connections, first to each body was an undercover agent. Gene Roberts, working for the Bureau of Special Services Investigations for the NYPD, is an undercover agent in Malcolm X's organization of Afro-American Unity, was the first to Malcolm's body when he was felled. Merrill McCullough, working at the time as an undercover agent with Memphis Police Department and later became a full-blown CIA agent, was the first to Dr. King's body, and as others have pointed out, was likely the first one to point upwardly in that famous picture, as you see depicted here, to the rooming house across the street, when most people have now determined, who have investigated this clearly, the shots came from below in the bushes, leading to a barrage of misunderstandings about that assassination. You all familiar with Judge Joe Brown, on TV? Not a lot of people are familiar with the fact that he was the presiding judge over James Earl Ray's, what would have been James Earl Ray's retrial. And he came to the conclusion himself. The federal government was absolutely involved in the assassination. The rifle they say that Ray used to kill King was not the rifle that had anything to do with the assassination. But in terms of his popular media portrayal, it's cool to have, Judge Joe Brown and, his silly reality show, but never would he be invited on anywhere to have a serious discussion about what the evidence he himself presided over. Neither crime has been appropriately solved. In fact, what most argue is the actual known killer of Malcolm X is still alive in the Northeast somewhere, living, I believe it's still in New Jersey actually, living more or less relatively comfortably. Or did he just pass recently? I have to double check that. Anyway. But the most important point, the state's goal of preventing the rise of a black messiah was reached. As Ishmael Reed, I understand, is quoted as saying, if you want to call me a conspiracy theorist, you have to first acknowledge yourself as a coincidence theorist. And coincidentally, the fears of the state were alleviated in the killings. So to move past the assassinations, what has happened in media, the symbolism of the two men, I think is summarized nicely by Amiri Baraka as well. There is, of course, he said, the syndrome Lenin spoke about when he said that once opponents of the bourgeoisie are dead, the rulers transform these class enemies into ciphers or agreeable sycophants of imperialism, however askew they might have seemed in life, who are now rehabilitated all the way into being represented as the very opposite ideologically of what they actually were in life. So as we look at the commemorations, Malcolm X on a stamp, and of course the memorial not far from here for Dr. King, researchers, scholars Deborah Atwater and Sandra Herndon have a brilliant essay some years ago on the politics of public memory. And they make this point that I think is also appropriate here. In a real sense, public memory refers to having a potential for a shared sense of the past, fashioned from symbolic resources of community and subject to its particular history, hierarchies, and aspirations. So in other words, Malcolm X, who was seen as a tyrant, as a violent, fearful figure in life, is later transformed by some scholars with whom I have strong disagreements. And one correction from the introduction, our book, co-edited by me and my good friend Dr. Todd Stephen Burrows, A Lie of Reinvention, Correcting Manning Marable's Malcolm X, actually came out at the end of 2012 and is out now on Black Classic Press. We invite you to check it out. Because what we argue is that Manning Marable did along with some scholars coming behind him, is to reform Malcolm X as somebody more palatable for today, rather than the man he actually was, and kind of diminished his radical politics so that you could have a New York Times bestseller, rather than encouraging people to really deal with what he was asking people to grapple with. And the same thing has been done to Dr. King. So they're commemorated, and their memorials and their public memory is, as these scholars say here, has been subordinated to the particular history and hierarchies and aspirations of the state itself. So Malcolm X is now they want people to see him as someone who had that post-Mecca change and became more soft and wanted to join, more the mainstream civil rights movement, and had abandoned all those radical, silly ideas he had embraced earlier. Dr. King is never acknowledged as having embraced radical ideas, critical of capitalism, critical of white supremacy, critical of militarism, critical of the symbolic changes. He said the Civil Rights Act, that's going to be commemorated the 50th anniversary soon. He said that's the equivalent of rushing the football to the 50-yard line and claiming a touchdown. That you may have the right to a job, or you may have the right to vote, but you actually said you may have the right to vote, but you don't have a right to a job. You don't have a right to a quality income, to equality in all avenues of life. And that's why he said, I have to, as you saw him saying there at the end in that video clip, he was saying we can't just stay comfortably within the political moment. He said, he said real leadership does not seek consensus. Is not a seeker of consensus, but a molder of consensus. So in other words, it's perfectly, for me at least as I understand it, acceptable to take unpopular positions if you're convinced that they are correct, and that's exactly what he was doing. So as many people commemorate King or Malcolm today, so many ignore the brilliant radicalism in their ideas and are encouraged to do so. Just as we wrap up, Malcolm X and Dr. King represented traditions of radical politics that remain threatening in a world rapidly increasing inequality. Daruba bin Wahad himself, a former political prisoner, has said that if Malcolm X were alive today, he would be a political prisoner. He would not be commemorated. There would not have been films made about him and people wearing X hats and all the other things that were happening when I was a little younger. He would be a political prisoner. And I would argue the same could be said of Dr. King. Dr. King would not have been invited to last year's commemoration of the March on Washington. He would not have been invited to his own march, given where he was in real life politically. The continued distortion of their public memory discourages successive generations from extending the struggle as these men and women like them saw as necessary. It is as if COINTELPRO remains effective, because finally, what COINTELPRO also said regarding the Black liberation movement was, quote, that a final goal should be to prevent the long-range growth of militant black nationalist organizations, especially among youth. Specific tactics to prevent these groups from converting young people must be developed. And from a 1969 private memo to J. Edgar Hoover, he was alerted that the Negro youth and moderate must be made to understand that if they succumb to revolutionary teaching, they will be dead revolutionaries. So finally, as I wrap up, I would argue that is in fact what has happened. That the Dr. King and the Malcolm X that are delivered unto successively younger generations are versions of those men that defy the men as they actually existed in real life and are meant to keep us from grappling with the ideas that they grappled with, which leads in part to what I started off with, the devolving material conditions of most people in this country and around the world. And as Fred Hampton used to say to you, I say peace if you're willing to fight for it. And thank you very much for having me this afternoon. Thank you.